Winter had a way of pressing itself against Eleanor Whitmore's cabin, until the walls felt thin enough for the cold to whisper through them. She stood outside that morning, her breath unspooling into the pale air, watching the sky lower itself toward the valley like a heavy, gray quilt being pulled down by an unseen hand. Snow lay deep around her boots, and every step left a soft hollow, as though the earth were exhaling beneath her weight. She had lived alone for 3 long years, long enough to learn the language of silence, long enough to sense changes in the wind before they arrived. Yet on this morning, the air carried something she could not name, a tautness that tugged at her ribs and made her fingers curl around the frayed edges of her shawl. Her husband's old fence leaned tiredly in the field behind her, boards warped by too many seasons and the slow erosion of loneliness. She visited it each morning the way some visited graves, touching one post, as if acknowledging the memory of a life that had once filled that small patch of land with laughter and possibility. Death had taught her patience. Isolation had taught her resilience. Winter had taught her quiet endurance. But none of them had taught her how to soften the ache that lived behind her ribs, the ache that returned each time she realized she had no voice but her own to break the stillness. The townsfolk had long since given up knocking on her door. Some said she preferred her ghosts. Others believed she was too proud to accept company. The truth was simpler and sadder. Solitude had become her armor. It wrapped around her like a thin, brittle shell, one she could not easily remove without risking the fragile pieces inside. Mrs. Alma Crowder visited when she could, bringing biscuits or gossip, but even that had become infrequent over the last winter. Snowfall cut off travel, and the road leading to Eleanor's homestead grew narrow with neglect. On most days she filled her hours with small work, mending blankets, patching her own clothes, tending the animals that remained loyal to her despite the cold. The routine steadied her mind, giving shape to days that otherwise might have collapsed into sorrow. She hummed absent-mindedly as she scattered feed for the last 3 hens who braved the winter, her voice a thin ribbon in the wind. She could almost imagine she wasn't alone when she sang. Almost. That morning, however, the world felt different. The breeze carried a strange warmth despite the freezing cold, warmth not of temperature but of presence, as though the snow itself were holding its breath. She straightened slowly, brushing frost from her gloves, listening for anything out of place. Silence stretched long across the fields, settling like a blanket across her shoulders, until she sensed it. The faint vibration of distant hoofbeats, muffled by snow yet unmistakable in their rhythm. Her heart stilled. Visitors did not come this far unless urgent need or danger pulled them. Eleanor backed toward her cabin instinctively, eyes scanning the white horizon. At first she saw nothing, only endless stretches of frozen land. But then, like shadows rising from the folds of winter, she spotted 2 immense figures on horseback approaching through the drifting veil of snow. Their silhouettes grew larger, clearer, heavier with each step, until she recognized the unmistakable broad shoulders and towering frames of Apache warriors. Her breath faltered. She had seen Apaches at a distance before, during trading days, during tense moments when settlers and tribe members eyed one another with quiet suspicion, but never had 2 giants ridden toward her home with such purposeful strides. They cut through the snow like dark flame through pale smoke, horses steaming, long braids dusted with frost. She swallowed hard, fingers trembling as she lifted her shawl to shield herself from the biting wind. The taller of the 2 rode in front. His face was carved in calm strength, lines of quiet responsibility shaping his expression. His gaze swept across her land, as though assessing not only the world but the shadows within it. Behind him his brother, slightly younger, equally formidable, held a steady posture, his presence radiating a gentler warmth despite his size. Their horses slowed as they neared her, hooves crunching through the snow until the brothers finally came to a halt several paces away. Eleanor forced her voice to steady itself. She asked if something had happened, her tone thinner than she wished. The older warrior dismounted without speaking at first, his boots sinking into the snow with a grounded certainty that sent a ripple of tension through her. When he stepped closer, she noticed the softness in his eyes, a softness that contrasted sharply with his towering frame. His breath fogged between them, mingling with hers like a quiet exchange neither fully understood. He spoke her name as if he had carried it with him for miles. His voice was deep, resonant, shaped by winters far harsher than this one. He told her the season ahead would be brutal, harsher than any in recent memory. Tracks of wolves had been found near her land. Strangers had passed too close to her cabin. Storms were forming in the northern sky. And solitude, he warned, would not protect her this time. The younger brother stepped beside him, nodding with grave agreement. His presence felt warmer, almost reassuring, as though he wished to soften the severity of his brother's words. Eleanor felt herself shift between fear and a strange flutter of trust, bewildered by the way their voices carried both warning and unexpected gentleness. Then the older brother spoke the words that would shatter the quiet rhythm of her life. "Pack your things and come with us." For a moment she could not breathe. The snow swirled around her like 1,000 trembling wings, blurring the world into white uncertainty. She stared at them, torn between instinctive caution and a pull she did not yet understand. Something in their eyes, especially the elders, held a truth that anchored her feet even as her heart raced. And as the wind rose, brushing against her cheeks like a whispered omen, she sensed that winter had finally brought not an ending, but a beginning she had never imagined. Snow clung to the coats of the two Apache brothers as they stood before Eleanor's door like carved guardians risen from the drifting white. For a suspended breath she only watched them, unable to decide whether the warmth she felt in her chest was warning or reassurance. The elder one, Tawa, she later learned, carried a stillness in his posture that reminded her of mountains, the kind that stood unchanged through generations. His younger brother, Kaya, had a spark in his eyes that flickered with something gentler, as though he could smile a storm into silence. When Eleanor lifted her hand and gestured them inside, it was not bravery guiding her, nor trust, but a quiet instinct that told her she would not face the winter alone after this morning. The moment the brothers stepped over her threshold, the air shifted. The wind's howl softened, the fire crackled with renewed life, and Eleanor felt something she had not felt in years, company fitting naturally into her space without overwhelming it. Tawa removed the snow from his shoulders with precise, deliberate movements, as though he wished to disturb nothing. Kaya stamped his boots and offered a soft greeting that warmed the room even before he reached the fire. Their presence filled the cabin but did not crowd it, each breath they took harmonizing with the cabin's long-held quiet. Eleanor busied herself with the teapot, hands trembling slightly as she poured hot water into the kettle, pretending the steam rising from the spout was the reason her face flushed. She sensed their eyes following her movements, not in suspicion or judgment, but in a way that made her feel seen with a clarity she had long forgotten. When she finally turned to face them, their expressions held patience, as though they would wait all morning for her to find the courage to ask why they had come. It was Tawa who finally spoke. His voice, deep and steady, filled the small cabin with a gravity that made her heartbeat slow. He explained that he and Kaya had tracked wolf prints near her property. Large ones, fresh ones, the kind that wandered too close when prey became scarce. Eleanor nodded, thinking of the eerie cries she'd heard last night but ignored, convincing herself the distance was safe. She had lived too long with silence, too long with her own stubborn belief that danger passed by those who stayed small and unnoticeable. Tawa's words stripped that illusion away. Kaya added his piece with a softer tone, telling her they had also found footprints from men. Not hunters from their tribe, not settlers from town, but drifters who traveled with hunger in their eyes and desperation in their bones. Men who saw an isolated cabin in the snow as an invitation. Eleanor felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. She knew the risks of living alone. She had simply hoped she would never be tested by them. The kettle hissed behind her, but she could not turn away from the concern in Kaya's gaze or the firm warning in Tawa's. When she finally managed to speak, her question came out fragile. Why her? Why today? Why had they ridden across the valley instead of simply waiting for danger to pass? Tawa's answer came without hesitation. Because winter did not spare the unguarded. Because storms grew sharper each year. Because sometimes the world gave warnings quietly, and ignoring them was a grief no one wished to carry. Kaya leaned forward, elbows on his knees, firelight dancing across the strong lines of his face. He told her he had remembered seeing her in town months ago, alone, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the wind. He had wondered then who helped her when storms rolled in. He had wondered who repaired her fences, who kept her warm, who heard her voice. The memory of her silence had stayed with him, he said. and the memory of her loneliness. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had spent years believing her isolation was invisible, that no one saw the cracks in her quiet life. To learn she had been noticed, even from afar, unsettled her in ways she could not name. She poured tea for them with slower hands, trying to mask the tremor of emotion beneath her ribs. When Kaya thanked her with a warm grin, she felt her chest loosen for the first time that day. For a while, the three sat around the fire, sharing the gentle hush that falls when strangers begin to understand each other. The brothers asked about her land, her animals, the storms she had braved last season. Their questions were respectful, careful, shaped with the intention to know her without intruding. Eleanor found herself speaking more than she expected, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. She realized only then how starved she was for conversation, not the shallow talk of passing neighbors, but the kind that allowed her to unfold slowly. When Tawa noticed the crack in her cabin door, he rose without a word and began to examine it. His movements were purposeful, decisive, revealing a man accustomed to building safety, rather than merely promising it. Kaya joined him, offering suggestions, teasing lightly when his brother dismissed a few of his ideas with a quiet shake of the head. Their banter made Eleanor smile despite the tension still curled in her stomach. She watched them repair the door with practiced skill, both brothers working in unspoken sync, and felt gratitude settle over her like a warm cloak. She did not expect visitors that day, but she certainly did not expect two warriors, strangers in name, familiar in spirit, to fix her door as though her home mattered to them. The world outside throbbed with winter's threat, yet inside her small cabin, she felt protected for the first time since her husband's death. When the brothers finished, snow began to fall more heavily outside. Tawa returned to sit near the fire, his expression shadowed with thought. He raked a hand through his hair and said quietly that the storm ahead was no ordinary storm. The winds coming from the north carried the kind of bite that stripped flesh from bone. Wolves grew bold in such weather. Men without shelter grew desperate. And a woman alone in a cabin at the edge of the valley. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Kaya leaned back, stretching his long limbs, his voice gentler but carrying the same truth. They had not come to frighten her. They had come because leaving her alone felt wrong. Because some burdens should not be carried in the cold. Eleanor felt her heartbeat shift, a pulse of fear mixing with something quieter, something warm and unfamiliar. She realized with dawning clarity that they were not merely delivering warnings, they were offering protection, offering presence, offering choice. She looked at the repaired door, then at the snow piling against her windows, then at the two men waiting with steady breaths. The wind outside rose in a long, low howl, shaking the cabin as if urging her to decide. Tawa stood, tall as a towering pine, and met her gaze with a weight that anchored her feet to the floor. "There is more," he said softly. "Something you ought to know before the storm fully arrives." And as the fire flickered, throwing restless shadows across his face, Eleanor felt the world tighten around that single moment, tighten and wait for the truth about to fall. Snow began falling in slow, deliberate flakes as Eleanor stepped outside her cabin, the two Apache brothers waiting beside their horses like sentinels guiding her into an unknown future. The air was sharp enough to sting her lungs, yet she felt strangely steadied by the presence of the men beside her. Tawa stood nearest, tightening the strap on his saddle with practiced care, his expression unreadable beneath the faint shimmer of frost gathering on his lashes. Kaya held her small bundle of belongings, offering her a reassuring smile that softened the weight of the moment. She felt a tremor of uncertainty in her chest, but also a quiet pull, as though some invisible thread tugged her toward the life awaiting beyond the valley. Her cabin looked small from where she stood, its roof layered in white, its windows clouded by the breath of many winters. For a heartbeat she hesitated, thinking of all the memories tucked between those thin walls, both gentle and painful. Then Tawa nodded once, a silent gesture of understanding, and she lifted her chin, letting the past fall away like dried leaves beneath snow. She allowed Kaya to help her onto his horse, feeling the warmth of his hands steady her knee as she settled behind him. Tawa mounted his own horse with fluid strength, snow scattering from his coat as he straightened. The journey began in a hush, hooves sinking into deep drifts that muffled the world into softer shapes. The cold pressed against Eleanor's cheeks until they burned, But Kaya kept his voice light, pointing out the ridges that guided their path, the distant line of pines that marked safer ground. She listened to his steady rhythm of words, small stories, small jokes, small threads of comfort that stitched her fear into something manageable. Behind his warmth, she sensed Tawa listening too, glancing back at intervals to ensure she was still riding securely, his silent attention forming a second shield around her. The valley stretched wide beneath the winter sky, white and undisturbed, except for the faint tracks of animals weaving between scattered bushes. Eleanor had traveled these lands only in summer, when grass waved in gold-green sweeps, and the wind carried the scent of river mud. Now everything felt transformed, as though the world had shed its colors and left only stark truths behind. She clung gently to Kaya's coat, feeling the rise and fall of his breath as the horses trudged forward. He spoke softly about storms, about the wisdom of traveling early, about the safety of the lodge they would reach before nightfall. Each word reminded her she was not navigating the winter alone anymore. At the edge of the valley, a gust of wind swept across their path, scattering snow in wild curls that momentarily blurred the world. She shut her eyes against the force of it, and when she opened them again, she found Tawa riding closer to her side, his horse angled protectively between her and the wind's bite. The small gesture struck her deeper than any grand promise could have. She watched the way snow clung to his braids, the way his shoulders tensed whenever the wind grew harsher, guarding not only himself but those who rode with him. Something warm flickered in her chest, fragile but unmistakable. Hours passed in steady rhythm. The brothers guided her through narrow passes and across icy riverbeds, where the frozen water cracked softly beneath the horse's weight. Eleanor felt her fear spike each time the ice groaned, but Tawa's calm presence steadied her. He extended a hand once, letting it hover just near her arm. Not touching, simply offering a silent anchor. She breathed easier after that, trusting his quiet confidence more than she trusted the shifting ice. They paused for a brief rest beneath the shelter of a rocky outcrop. Kaya offered her a piece of dried fruit from his pouch, grinning when she tried to warm her cold fingers by blowing on them. Tawa scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes, reading the sky's changing mood with practiced intuition. When he finally spoke, his voice rumbled with certainty. A heavier storm was coming. They would need to hurry if they wished to reach the lodge before the worst of it. Mounting again, Eleanor felt her heart thrum with a mixture of fear and determination. The storm clouds thickened, transforming the sky into a massive gray shroud. Snow began falling harder, sharp flakes stinging her skin. Kaya lowered his voice to keep her calm, but even his spirited tone held an undercurrent of urgency now. The wind howled between the rocks like a restless spirit, pushing against them with increasing force. Eleanor tightened her grip on Kaya, feeling him lean forward to urge the horse onward. The world narrowed to shimmering white. Trees blurred. Distance dissolved. Only the brothers' presence remained solid, dark silhouettes guiding her through the blizzard. Tawa led the way, his form barely visible at times, yet she sensed him with a certainty deeper than sight. When his horse slowed, she knew they were nearing something, either danger or sanctuary. The storm finally broke into a frenzy of swirling snow, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as Kaya murmured reassurance over his shoulder. Then, through the white veil, she spotted faint lanterns shimmering like timid stars. Warm light glowed in the distance, haloed by the storm's fury. Relief washed over her so strongly, she nearly sagged against Kaya's back. But as they drew closer, she noticed Tawa stiffen, lifting his hand to signal a halt. The horses slowed. The wind shrieked past them, carrying strange shapes of shadow and light across the snow. Eleanor's pulse quickened, unsure of what he sensed. Kaya straightened, his earlier warmth replaced by alert focus. For a long moment the three of them remained still, snow gathering on their shoulders, breath rising in pale clouds. Then Tawa spoke, his voice low and rough with something she had not heard in him before. "Someone has been here ahead of us." The storm swallowed the rest of his words, but Eleanor felt the meaning echo through her chest, sharp as the wind that cut across the valley. The lodge was warmer than Eleanor expected, its walls lined with woven blankets, its fire cracking with a deep, steady breath that seemed to rise from the earth itself. After the brutal storm outside, the sheltered light felt like stepping into another world. Children peeked from behind doorway curtains, Elders murmured welcomes, and the scent of sage and cedar curled through the air like gentle hands easing tension from her shoulders. Kaya guided her to a low bench near the fire, his smile soft with relief, while Tawa remained standing near the entrance, scanning the stormlit darkness as though he expected the wind itself to knock on the door. His vigilance unsettled her in ways she did not yet understand. As she warmed her numb fingers, she watched him pace with slow, deliberate steps, each movement revealing the weight of responsibility he carried like a hidden scar. Kaya dropped down beside her on the bench, shaking snow from his hair and grinning when she offered him a blanket. He accepted it with exaggerated gratitude, his voice playful and his presence soothing in the softest way. She found herself relaxing as he teased her for shivering like a pup in early winter. She replied with a small laugh, and the sound startled her. It had been years since laughter rose from her chest without effort. But it was Tawa's quiet presence at the edge of the room that pulled at her attention like a distant drumbeat. Even when he said nothing, she sensed him. The heaviness of his thoughts, the sharpness of his protective instincts, the way his shoulders carried a strength shaped by countless winters. She wondered what he had seen outside before bringing her here, what shadows had carved that sternness into his brow. When the storm calmed slightly, one of the elders called Tawa over, speaking in a hushed, serious tone. Eleanor could not hear the words, but she saw the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. Whatever concern followed them from her homestead had not been left behind with the wind. Kaya sensed her tension and nudged her gently, telling her the elders always worried more loudly than necessary. Yet beneath his charm, she saw a flicker of unease too. Their ease with one another, the unspoken communication of years spent side by side, made her heart twist with longing for a closeness she had never truly known. Over the next days, Eleanor settled into the quiet rhythms of lodge life. Women taught her how to braid winter herbs, children asked her to tell stories of her cabin, and Kaya often appeared at her side like a warm, steady flame. He showed her the safest paths between the cabins, the trick of keeping snow from seeping inside her boots, the way to hold her shawl against the wind. His kindness did not demand anything. No promises, no fear, no memory of loss. She found solace in that ease. But the moments that lingered longest were those she shared with Tawa. He repaired the latch on her temporary door one morning, kneeling with quiet precision, while she held a lantern near him. The glow cast soft gold across his strong features, illuminating the faint scars near his temple. She found herself studying the shape of his hands, the steadiness of his breath. When he stood, the lantern trembled slightly in her grasp, and he reached to steady it, his fingers brushing the back of her hand. The touch was brief, but carried a warmth that rooted itself deep within her chest. Later that evening, she stepped outside to gather kindling, and found Tawa standing by the edge of the clearing, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the tree line. The moon cast a pale glow across the snow, stretching his shadow far behind him. She approached slowly, unsure whether she was interrupting something sacred or simply joining a man who had forgotten the art of rest. He did not look at her when she stopped beside him, but she felt his awareness shift toward her, subtle as a heartbeat. He told her the storm had not erased the tracks he found. Someone had indeed been near the lodge before they arrived. Someone following a trail that led back toward the valley where her cabin stood alone. She felt the burn of fear tighten her throat, and Tawa, noticing her breath falter, softened his voice. For now, he said, she was safe. For now, the storm had driven all dangers far away. But the way he said it, quiet, firm, carrying both reassurance and warning, made her realize he had taken her safety upon himself without question or hesitation. As days passed, she found herself drawn to his silence as much as to Kaya's warmth. Tawa's quiet company felt like stepping into the stillness between snowflakes, gentle, grounding, unexpectedly intimate. They walked together sometimes, not speaking unless the moment required it. He showed her the frozen riverbank, where sunlight glinted off the ice like shattered glass. She stepped too close once, the thin crust groaning beneath her, and Tawa's hand shot out to pull her back, his grip firm around her wrist. Their eyes met, breath mingling in the cold, and something in his gaze softened in a way that left her trembling long after he let go. Kaya noticed. She saw it in the small flicker of sadness behind his smile, when he caught her staring after Tawa one afternoon. Instead of turning away, he sat beside her on the lodge steps, their arms brushing lightly. He told her he was glad she felt safe, glad she laughed more now. But his voice carried a shadow she could not ignore. She wondered whether his feelings for her were deeper than he allowed himself to show, and the thought made her chest tighten with guilt. Yet Kaya, sensing her unease, simply placed a hand over hers and squeezed gently, as though giving her permission to breathe. The bonds forming between them shifted like thawing ice, slow, delicate, unpredictable. Eleanor found herself wanting to understand both brothers, to learn the corners of their hearts she had only glimpsed. Kaya's joy, Tawa's silence, the weight of their shared history. All of it became a puzzle she yearned to hold. The lodge grew warmer each day, not because of the fire, but because of the kindness woven into every moment. But the storm had left more than snow in its wake. One evening, just as the sun began sinking behind the mountains, Tawa returned from scouting the valley with tension carved into every line of his body. The elders gathered in quick murmurs, their voices rising like unsettled birds. Eleanor watched from the doorway of her cabin, her pulse dancing with dread. Tawa finally stepped toward her, his expression grave, his footsteps heavy with the weight of truth. He stopped only a few paces away, the cold burning in the air between them. "They found new tracks today," he said quietly. "Not wolves. Not hunters. Someone is still searching for you." Snow drifted softly outside Eleanor's door, each flake falling with the quiet certainty of a world preparing itself for Christmas. Lanterns glowed along the lodge path like small guardian stars, their warm halos trembling in the breath of winter. Eleanor stood at the threshold, fingers curled against the wooden frame, her heartbeat a fragile pulse under her ribs. Tawa's words still rang inside her. Someone was searching for her. Someone bold enough to follow tracks through brutal storms. She had never felt hunted before. She did now. Kaya had tried to ease her fear by staying close, keeping his voice light, offering to sharpen new wooden latches for her door. Children had sung winter songs to keep spirits high, weaving evergreen branches into braided garlands. Elders prepared the Christmas stew, humming low, melodic rhythms that filled the air with comfort. Every corner of the lodge tried to anchor her. But fear clung to her like a second skin, whispering doubts, unraveling her sense of safety with invisible threads. Tawa remained distant that day, his eyes trained on the valley like a hawk guarding its nest. She saw him standing near the riverbank, watching the frozen water, as though it might rise and speak the truth he wouldn't voice. Kaya approached her once, brushing snow from her shoulder, telling her she looked pale. She thanked him softly, but her eyes kept drifting back to the tall figure near the river, the one whose silence pressed against her senses more heavily than any storm. When night approached, the lodge prepared for their humble Christmas gathering. Lanterns were hung from poles, small gifts carved by hand were exchanged with quiet joy, and firelight painted the walls with soft amber glow. Children rushed to place pine cones near the hearth, believing they brought good fortune. Eleanor helped braid cedar branches, her fingers trembling only slightly. But her gaze kept seeking Tawa through every shifting shadow. He entered the lodge late, snow tangled in his braids, shoulders dusted with frost. His presence seemed to still the room. The elders looked at him with questions in their eyes, but he gave them no words. Instead, he crossed the room with heavy steps, stopping only when he was close enough that Eleanor could feel the cold rising from his coat. She whispered his name, unsure if she had the right to say it with the concern that knotted her chest. He held her gaze for a heartbeat, something unspoken burning there, then turned away and stepped back into the snow. Eleanor didn't think. She simply followed. The world outside was a white echo, the wind sighing through bare branches like a tired old song. Tawa walked until he reached the edge of the clearing, where lantern light faded into winter's breath. When he finally stopped, Eleanor stood several paces behind him, her breath forming delicate clouds that scattered into the darkness. She wanted to speak, but fear and longing tangled inside her throat, leaving her with silence, until he broke it for her. His voice was low, rough, carrying the weight of nights he had never allowed himself to feel. He told her he'd gone back to her homestead that morning, following the new tracks. He found signs someone had entered her barn, disturbed the ashes beside her hearth, walked through her rooms. Whoever had come had not abandoned the search. Eleanor felt a cold wave rush through her, colder than the wind that clawed at her shawl. She whispered a shaky question. Why would anyone search for her? Her cabin held nothing of value. Her life was quiet, small. He turned to face her, and the snow caught on his lashes, softening his strong features. With a steadiness that made her heart crack, he told her loneliness itself could make a woman vulnerable. Men drifting through winter, desperate for shelter or prey, often saw isolated homes as easy marks. He had watched enough winters claim enough women to know when danger stalked in footsteps that dared cross sacred land. She stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing the snow like a trembling whisper. She told him she felt foolish for not noticing, foolish for being so unguarded, foolish for feeling safe only because he and Kaya stood beside her. Tawa's eyes softened. Not with pity, but with something deeper, something that warmed the space between their breaths. He reached up slowly and brushed a strand of wind-tossed hair from her cheek, the gesture so tender it made her knees weaken. He told her she wasn't foolish. She was brave. She had survived years of winter alone. She had held her loneliness with quiet dignity. But no one should face storms without shelter or danger without protection. His hand lingered near her cheek, hovering as if seeking permission to stay longer. Before she could speak, a gust of wind swirled around them, scattering snow in a dazzling spiral. It wrapped the night in a shimmering hush, and in that stillness Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since her husband died. An ache that wasn't pain, but possibility. She stepped closer until she felt the heat of his chest beneath his coat, and when she asked him why he cared so deeply, the question was barely a whisper. Tawa inhaled sharply, the breath catching in his throat like truth trapped behind years of restraint. His voice trembled for the first time as he said he hadn't meant to care. Hadn't meant to watch over her from a distance each winter. Hadn't meant for concern to shift into something heavier, something that kept him awake on nights when the valley winds howled like haunted spirits. He told her he'd first seen her tending her garden 2 summers ago, standing with sunlight tangled in her hair, believing no one watched her. Something inside him had softened, then tightened, then changed. Eleanor's breath hitched, the world narrowing to the warmth in his eyes. He confessed that he had ridden past her homestead whenever storms came, making sure the smoke still curled from her chimney. He confessed he had prayed, quietly, privately, that she would survive each winter until spring returned. He confessed he feared the day he might find her cabin silent, untouched snow blanketing the doorway, no footprints leading out. Eleanor reached for his hand without thinking, grasping it tightly, feeling the roughness of a man who had lived more winters than most survived. Her voice trembled as she told him no one had ever cared for her like that. No one had guarded her without expecting anything in return. No one had seen her without demanding she change to fit a world that seemed unable to understand her quietness. Tawa's breath shuddered. He stepped closer, bowing his forehead toward hers, snow melting on his skin. He told her he tried not to love her. He tried to keep his heart steady. But winter had a way of stripping truth down to bone, and in the silent nights he had realized he could not lie to himself anymore. He loved her, not as a fragile widow, not as a woman lost to the valley, but as a soul with fire beneath her quiet. A soul he respected, admired, wanted to protect not out of duty but devotion. Eleanor felt tears rise, warm against the cold. She whispered that she thought her heart had died with her past, buried beneath years of loneliness. But standing before him now in Christmas snow, she felt it thaw, felt it beat, felt it open. And as Tawa wrapped his arms around her for the first time, holding her with a tenderness that made the snow hush around them, Eleanor knew the truth she had feared to name. She was falling in love with the man who had watched over her long before she ever met him. But before she could speak the words forming inside her, Tawa stiffened, his arms tightening protectively. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed from the darkness behind the trees. Someone was approaching the lodge. Someone who had followed her trail all the way to Christmas night.